There are moments in your life that act like a shutter. They arrive without fanfare, disguised as ordinary Tuesday afternoons or rainy Thursday nights. And they capture an image of you so complete, so unflinchingly honest, that everything that comes after is merely the process of developing that single, definitive exposure. For me, that moment wasn't a grand event. It was a quiet click in a sun-drenched room, the sound almost lost in the hum of a lazy summer day. It was the moment Sam lowered his camera, his eye no longer hidden behind the lens, and looked at me as if he were seeing the final print for the very first time. He had spent his entire career capturing the curated joy of other people's lives, the peak of the aisle, the triumphant kiss, the first dance under a canopy of fairy lights. And yet, the only picture I ever saw framed on his wall, the only one he ever printed for himself, was of me. Just me, sitting on the floor of his studio, laughing at something he'd said, unaware that I was being documented, cataloged, and kept. It was a picture of a man who was deeply, quietly, and hopelessly in love, a secret the camera had somehow known before I ever had the courage to admit it aloud. And looking at it now, years later, I understand that he wasn't just taking a photograph. He was making a choice. He was preserving the before in a way that all but guaranteed an after. We met in the way that feels almost cliché for stories like ours, a collision of circumstance in a place designed for such things. It was a university library, a cavernous, hushed cathedral of knowledge where the only acceptable sounds were the rustle of turning pages and the soft, rhythmic tapping of keyboards. I was a painter, or trying to be one, holed up in a dusty corner of the fine arts section, surrounded by towering books on chiaroscuro and the emotional weight of color theory. He was a business major, of all things, a fact I found endlessly amusing later on, who had apparently wandered into the wrong section looking for a textbook on macroeconomic trends. He looked entirely out of place, a vibrant slash of energy in a monochrome world of academic stillness. He wore a faded band t-shirt and jeans that were more whole than denim, and his hair was a chaotic masterpiece that defied gravity. He had a camera slung over his shoulder, a heavy, professional-looking thing that seemed like an extension of his own body. It was the camera that started our first conversation. I asked him what he shot, and the guarded, slightly lost look on his face melted away, replaced by an incandescent enthusiasm that lit up the entire dim aisle. He talked about light, about capturing moments that were so fleeting they barely registered in memory, about the story a person's hands could tell. He wasn't a business major. He was an artist disguised as one, hiding his passion under a veneer of practicality for the sake of his parents. Our friendship was built in those stolen hours, in the liminal spaces between lectures and late-night study sessions. We were an odd pairing. I was the quiet observer, the one who preferred the solitude of my studio, the slow, meditative process of mixing paint on a palette. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of social energy, who collected friends like he collected lenses. Yet, with me, he was different. The frantic energy subsided, replaced by a comfortable, easy stillness. We could sit in silence for hours, me sketching in my notepad, him meticulously cleaning his camera parts on the worn coffee table in our shared dorm room, and the quiet was never empty. It was a space filled with a deep, unspoken understanding, a sense of being perfectly at home in another person's presence. He became my greatest champion, the first person to see my clumsy, amateur paintings not for what they were, but for what they could be. He would stand in front of a new canvas, his head tilted, his expression serious, and find the one brushstroke, the one sliver of color that worked, and he would praise it with such genuine conviction that I started to believe him. He saw the artist in me before I was brave enough to claim the title for myself. And I, in turn, became the keeper of his secret self. I was the only one he showed his personal work to, not the glossy, smiling photos he took for the university newspaper, but the other ones. The grainy, black and white shots of lonely street corners at dawn, the intimate portraits of strangers on the subway, their faces etched with weariness and grace, the abstract images of light filtering through a dusty window pane. They were beautiful and melancholic, filled with a profound sense of yearning that resonated with a part of me I kept carefully hidden. I saw in his photographs the same quiet loneliness that lived inside of me, a shared frequency that hummed between us, unspoken but deeply felt. He was teaching me to see the world, and I was giving him a safe place to show me what he saw. It was a perfect, delicate symbiosis, a friendship so profound that the thought of jeopardizing it with the messy, complicated truth of my own feelings was unthinkable. Because, of course, I had fallen in love with him. It hadn't been a sudden crash, but a slow, imperceptible tide, pulling me under so gradually that I didn't realize I was drowning until I was already far from shore. It was in the way his laugh crinkled the corners of his eyes, the way he would absent-mindedly run a hand through his hair when he was concentrating, the way he always seemed to know when I needed a cup of coffee before I knew it myself. These small, insignificant details became the architecture of my affection, building a silent cathedral of devotion inside my chest. After graduation, our lives diverged and then, thankfully, converged again. He abandoned the pretense of a business career, much to his family's chagrin, and threw himself into photography with a singular, ferocious passion. He started with small gigs, local events, portraits for aspiring actors, but it was weddings where he found his true calling. It was a perfect fit for his personality. He could command a room, put anxious brides at ease, charm grumpy uncles, and find the perfect, candid moment in the midst of chaos. He was a storyteller, and a wedding was the ultimate story of hope and new beginnings. I, on the other hand, retreated further into my own world. I found a small studio apartment with good northern light and began to paint in earnest, supporting myself with a quiet job at a local art gallery. We lived in the same city, two separate orbits that intersected regularly. Our friendship remained the one constant, the anchor in the turbulent sea of our 20s. He would show up at my door after a long wedding weekend, exhausted and smelling of champagne and hairspray, and collapse onto my worn-out sofa, recounting tales of bridezillas and runaway ring-bearers. I would listen, make him tea, and feel that familiar, bittersweet ache in my heart. He dated, of course, a series of bright, beautiful women who were drawn to his energy like moths to a flame. I learned to be the supportive friend, to listen to his stories of new romance with a carefully constructed smile, to offer advice I didn't feel qualified to give. I met them, shook their hands, and tried to ignore the sharp, painful twist in my gut when he would sling an arm around their shoulders, a casual gesture of ownership that I craved with a desperate, silent intensity. There was Chloe, the longest of them. She was a landscape architect, smart and kind, and for 2 years, I watched Sam try to build a life with her. I convinced myself I was happy for him. I told myself that his happiness was the most important thing, and if she was the source of it, then I would learn to live with the ghost of what I wanted. But his work, the very thing that defined him, became a source of quiet irony. He was surrounded by love, documenting it in exquisite detail, creating timeless heirlooms of other people's joy, yet in his own life, it seemed just out of reach. With Chloe, he was performing a version of the happiness he photographed. He was following the script, hitting the marks, but I could see the disconnect in his eyes. The light he captured so brilliantly in others wasn't quite reaching his own. I saw it because I was looking for it, because a part of me, a selfish, hopeful part, needed to see it. The breakup with Chloe wasn't a dramatic explosion. It was a slow, quiet erosion. There was no shouting match, no final, tearful confrontation, just a mutual, sad acknowledgement that they were building their foundation on different ground. He told me about it one evening, sitting on my fire escape, the city lights twinkling below us like a fallen constellation. He wasn't crying. He just looked hollowed out, like a beautiful, empty building after all the furniture has been removed. He spoke about it in practical terms, about incompatible life goals and diverging paths, but I heard the unspoken truth beneath the words. He was lonely, not just because he had lost a partner, but a deeper, more fundamental loneliness that had been with him all along, a void he had been trying to fill with the reflected light of other people's happiness. He was a curator of joy who had forgotten how to cultivate his own. That night was the beginning of the shift. The carefully drawn boundaries of our friendship, the ones I had so painstakingly maintained for years, began to dissolve, not with a flood, but with a slow, seeping tide. The foundation we had built was about to be tested, and I was terrified that it, too, would wash away. He started coming over more often after that. It began subtly. A text message late at night. "You up?" Followed by his appearance at my door minutes later, holding a carton of takeout or a six-pack of beer, his face etched with a weariness that went bone deep. He never explicitly said he needed me, but his presence was a confession in itself. He was seeking refuge, and my small, quiet apartment became his sanctuary. He would talk for hours, not about Chloe or the breakup, but about everything and nothing, about a difficult client, a new lens he was saving up for, a strange dream he'd had. He was filling the silence, his own and mine, with the mundane hum of his life, and I understood that he was trying to recalibrate his own existence, to find his center of gravity again. I became his anchor, his fixed point in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. And I, fool that I was, let him. I welcomed the disruption, the late-night intrusions, because they were infusions of him, and I was hopelessly addicted. I told myself it was what any good friend would do, but I knew, in the deepest, most honest part of my heart, that I was hoping for something more. I was a patient cartographer, mapping the slow, creeping advance of his reliance on me, praying it would eventually lead him to the place I had been waiting for all along. The ritual began on a cold autumn night. A storm was raging outside, the wind rattling the old window frames of my apartment, the rain lashing against the glass in furious, percussive waves. Sam had been there for hours, sprawled on my sofa, a heavy wool blanket pulled up to his chin. We had been watching an old black-and-white film, the dialogue a soft murmur beneath the symphony of the storm. He was quiet, his usual vibrant energy muted, his body language speaking of a deep, profound exhaustion. I watched him from the armchair, pretending to be absorbed in the film, but my attention was entirely focused on the subtle rise and fall of his chest, the way his eyelids grew heavy and fluttered closed. He was fighting sleep, but it was a losing battle. Eventually, his head lolled to the side, coming to rest on the arm of the sofa. He looked deeply uncomfortable, his neck craned at an awkward angle. A war raged inside of me. A part of me, the friend, wanted to wake him, to tell him to go home to his own bed. But another part, the lover, the part that had been starved for years, saw an opportunity. It was a selfish, terrible thought, but it was undeniable. After a long, silent debate, I moved. I walked over to the sofa, my heart hammering against my ribs, and gently, so gently, I lifted his head and slid onto the cushion beside him, letting his head come to rest on my shoulder. He stirred, a soft, mumbled sound escaping his lips, but he didn't wake. He settled into the warmth of my body, his breath evening out into the slow, steady rhythm of deep sleep. I sat there, rigid and unmoving, for what felt like an eternity. Every nerve in my body was on fire. I was acutely aware of the weight of his head on my shoulder, the soft texture of his hair against my cheek, the scent of him, a mix of rain, coffee, and something uniquely Sam. It was both heaven and hell. It was everything I had ever wanted, offered under a pretext of plausible deniability. He was just tired. I was just being a good friend. The lies we tell ourselves to survive. I didn't sleep that night. I sat there until the first pale, gray light of dawn began to filter through the window, my arm numb, my body aching, but my heart full of a dangerous, terrifying hope. When he finally woke, he blinked slowly, a look of soft confusion on his face. He lifted his head from my shoulder, and for a moment, his eyes met mine. There was no embarrassment, no awkwardness, just a quiet, sleepy gratitude. "Thanks," he mumbled, stretching like a cat. And that was it. The line had been crossed, and neither of us acknowledged it. That night became the blueprint. The ritual was established, unspoken but mutually understood. His late-night visits became a fixture of my week. He would arrive, bearing his usual offerings of food or drink, and we would settle onto the sofa to watch a movie. And somewhere, between the opening credits and the final scene, he would drift off to sleep, his head finding its now familiar place on my shoulder. It became our new normal, a quiet, intimate routine that existed in a liminal space between friendship and something more. I became an expert in the geography of his sleep. I learned the way his breathing deepened when he was truly unconscious, the slight twitch of his fingers when he was dreaming, the soft, almost inaudible sighs he would make. The sofa, once just a piece of furniture, transformed into a sacred, charged landscape. It was our island, a place where the rules of the outside world didn't apply. I analyzed every moment, every subtle shift, searching for meaning. When his hand, in his sleep, brushed against mine and stayed there, I would hold my breath, my mind racing. Was it an accident? A subconscious confession? When he would shift closer, his body pressing against mine, was he seeking warmth, or was he seeking me? This period was a masterclass in self-torture. I was living in a state of suspended animation, caught between the exquisite pleasure of his proximity and the agonizing uncertainty of his intentions. My own work began to reflect my internal state. My paintings became studies in light and shadow, filled with blurred lines and ambiguous forms, figures half hidden in darkness, reaching for something just out of frame. I was painting my own longing, my own hope and fear. My friends at the gallery noticed the change. "You've found a new depth," my boss, a kind, elderly woman named Martha, commented one afternoon, peering at a new canvas I had brought in. "There's a tension here, a feeling of waiting." She was right. I was waiting for him to wake up, both literally and figuratively, waiting for a sign, a word, anything that would give me permission to believe that this wasn't all in my head. But Sam remained a beautiful, unreadable enigma. Awake, he was my friend, cheerful, funny, deflecting any attempt at emotional intimacy with a joke or a change of subject. Asleep, he was something else entirely. He was vulnerable, trusting, his body language a silent testament to a need he would never voice. The ritual escalated, as I both feared and hoped it would. One night, after a particularly grueling wedding shoot, he arrived at my apartment looking utterly depleted. He was pale, with dark circles under his eyes, and he moved with the slow, deliberate gait of someone running on fumes. He barely made it to the sofa before he was asleep, his body slumping against mine. A few hours later, he woke with a start, groaning as he tried to sit up. "My neck is killing me," he rasped, rubbing the back of it. "I can't keep doing this." My heart sank. I thought he meant the late nights, the sleeping on the sofa, the reliance on me. I thought the ritual was over. "You should just stay," I heard myself say, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. In the guest room, it wasn't a guest room. It was my studio, a small, cluttered space with a single mattress on the floor that I used for napping during long painting sessions. But it was a bed. It was an offer. He looked at me, his eyes clouded with exhaustion. "Are you sure?" I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. "Of course. It's just a mattress, but it's better than the couch." He didn't argue. He stumbled into the studio, and I heard the soft thud of his body hitting the mattress. I lay in my own bed that night, separated by a thin wall, listening to the sound of his breathing. He was closer than ever, yet the distance felt immense. The door to the studio was left slightly ajar, a sliver of hallway light cutting across the floor. It felt like a symbol, a question hanging in the air. The studio mattress became the new normal. He would arrive, we would perform our ritual of movies and conversation, and then, instead of the agonizing dance on the sofa, he would simply retreat to the studio. He started leaving a few things at my place: a toothbrush, a change of clothes, his favorite coffee mug. My apartment, once solely my own, was slowly, imperceptibly, becoming our space. He was weaving himself into the fabric of my life, his threads becoming indistinguishable from my own. And the door was always left ajar. It became another part of the ritual, another unspoken rule. I would lie awake, staring at that sliver of light, my mind a whirlwind of possibilities. Was it an invitation? A sign of trust? Or was it just a coincidence, a careless oversight? I was living in a world of symbols, reading meaning into every gesture, every half-opened door, every lingering glance. I was a detective searching for clues in a case where I was the only suspect, my own hope the only evidence. I was going mad with it, the constant analysis, the emotional tightrope walk. Something had to give. I knew it, but I was too terrified to be the one to push. I was a quiet observer, a painter of shadows, not a catalyst for change. I was content, or so I told myself, to live in the beautiful, painful ambiguity of our arrangement, because the thought of losing it, of losing him, was more than I could bear. The risk of clarity was too great. The breaking point arrived on a night that was utterly unremarkable. There was no storm, no external drama, just the quiet hum of the city outside my window. Sam was not on the studio mattress. We were on the sofa, an old habit we'd fallen back into, watching some mindless action movie. He hadn't fallen asleep. His head was on my shoulder, but his eyes were open, staring blankly at the screen. The credits rolled, casting the room in a shifting pattern of white text on a black background. I made a move to get up, to suggest it was time for bed, but his hand shot out, his fingers closing around my wrist. It wasn't a tight grip, but it was firm, definitive. It was a clear, unambiguous signal. Stay? I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The silence in the room was deafening. It was no longer the comfortable quiet we so often shared. It was a heavy, charged silence, thick with years of unspoken words, of repressed feelings, of carefully avoided truths. I could hear the frantic beat of my own heart, a frantic drum against the stillness. He shifted, lifting his head from my shoulder. He turned to face me, his body angled towards mine on the small sofa. The flickering light from the television screen played across his face, illuminating the exhaustion and something else, something I had never seen there before. It was a raw, terrifying vulnerability. His eyes, usually so full of light and laughter, were dark, deep pools of uncertainty. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, trying to decide whether to jump. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, as if the words were trapped in his throat. I waited, my entire being focused on him, on this single, pivotal moment. The world had narrowed to the space between us, the few inches of charged air that separated our bodies. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, could smell the faint scent of the soap he used. Every sensory detail was amplified, etched into my memory. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper, a rough, hesitant sound in the quiet room. Leo, just my name. But the way he said it, it was a question, a plea, a confession all rolled into one. It held the weight of 1,000 conversations we had never had. Yeah, I managed to reply, my own voice sounding strained and unfamiliar to my ears. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He just looked at me, his gaze searching my face, as if looking for an answer, for permission. I saw the conflict in his eyes, the fear warring with a desperate need. I realized then that he was just as scared as I was. He, the unknowing initiator, the one who had driven this slow, agonizing dance, was just as lost in it as I had been. He wasn't in control. He was just as much at the mercy of this thing between us as I was. That realization gave me a surge of courage. I held his gaze, trying to pour all the reassurance, all the years of patient, unwavering affection into my eyes. I was trying to tell him, without words, that it was okay. Whatever this was, we would face it together. He took a slow, shaky breath. Would it be okay, he began, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. He paused, swallowed hard, and tried again. Would it be okay if I kissed you? The question hung in the air between us, fragile and luminous. It was the most terrifying and beautiful thing I had ever heard. He wasn't assuming. He wasn't taking. He was asking. He was offering me a choice, giving me an out, respecting the friendship that we were both so terrified of breaking. In that single question, he laid himself bare, offering up his own vulnerability as a gesture of trust. All the years of waiting, of quiet desperation, of analyzing every touch and every glance, coalesced into this one moment of perfect, terrifying clarity. My answer was not a word. It was a slow, deliberate nod. It was the movement of my body, leaning in towards him, closing the final, infinitesimal gap between us. It was the closing of my eyes, a gesture of complete and utter surrender. His lips met mine with a hesitant, almost reverent touch. It wasn't a kiss of passion or demand. It was a question, a discovery, a quiet exploration. It was soft and uncertain, a tentative mapping of new territory. I could feel the slight tremor in his hands as he brought them up to cup my face, his thumbs stroking gently over my cheekbones. It was a kiss that tasted of salt and relief, the release of years of pent-up tension, of unspoken longing. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had. It was a confession, an apology, and a promise all at once. When he finally pulled away, he didn't go far. He rested his forehead against mine, our breath mingling in the small space between us. His eyes were still closed, his expression one of profound, exhausted relief, as if he had just completed a long and arduous journey and had finally arrived home. We stayed like that for a long time, neither of us speaking, the silence no longer charged with tension, but filled with a deep, resonant peace. The shutter had clicked. The image was captured. And now, the slow, uncertain process of developing it in the dark was about to begin. The morning after was a study in silence and absence. I woke alone in my bed, the first rays of sunlight striping the floor. For a fleeting, disoriented moment, I thought I had dreamed it all. The charged silence, the whispered question, the shattering, gentle kiss. But the indentation on the pillow next to mine was real, as was the lingering scent of his shampoo. He was gone. I found his coffee mug, washed and dried, sitting next to the sink. On the kitchen counter was a hastily scrawled note on a napkin. Had to run. Early shoot. Talk later. 3 short, devastatingly neutral sentences. No mention of the night before. No acknowledgement of the seismic shift that had occurred between us. The talk later felt less like a promise and more like a polite, cowardly postponement of the inevitable. A cold dread, familiar and sickening, began to seep into my bones, chilling the warmth that the memory of the kiss had left behind. I had been a fool. I had misinterpreted everything. It was a moment of confusion, of loneliness, a mistake born of grief and proximity. He regretted it. He was running away. The next few days were a special kind of hell, a limbo of unanswered texts and calls that went straight to voicemail. The vibrant, constant presence that had filled my apartment and my life was suddenly, violently absent. The silence he left behind was a screaming void. The sofa looked accusingly empty. The door to my studio was firmly, unequivocally closed. I tried to work, to lose myself in my painting, but my hands felt clumsy, my inspiration gone. All I could create were murky, gray canvases, the color of my own despair. I replayed the kiss over and over in my mind, dissecting it frame by frame, searching for the clue I had missed. Had I been too eager? Had I pushed him? But no, he had asked. He had initiated it. The memory was clear, undeniable. So what had changed between the darkness of night and the harsh light of morning? The anxiety was a physical thing, a tight knot in my stomach that made it impossible to eat or sleep. I was spiraling, my carefully constructed world tilting precariously on its axis. The hope that had sustained me for years was curdling into a bitter, resentful poison. After a week of this agonizing silence, I couldn't take it anymore. The waiting was destroying me. I needed to know, even if the truth was the one I feared the most. I needed to hear it from him. I needed the finality of a rejection to cauterize the wound. Anything was better than this corrosive uncertainty. I went to his studio. It was in a converted warehouse district, a huge, airy space with high ceilings and massive windows that flooded the room with light. It was a place I had always loved, a space that felt so intrinsically him. It was filled with his equipment, with backdrops and light stands, and the walls were covered with the joyful, smiling faces of strangers. I found him in the back, in the small, cluttered office where he did his editing. He was staring at a computer screen, a half-empty coffee cup by his elbow, looking as exhausted and hollowed out as I felt. He didn't hear me come in. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him, my resolve wavering. He looked so fragile, so lost. But then he ran a hand through his hair, the same gesture I had seen 1,000 times, and a wave of anger, hot and sharp, cut through my fear. I deserved more than a note on a napkin. Sam, my voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence of the large room like a shard of glass. He flinched, his whole body going rigid. He turned slowly in his chair, and when his eyes met mine, I saw a flicker of something that looked like panic. He looked like a cornered animal. He quickly schooled his features into a neutral mask, but it was too late. I had seen the fear. Leo, hey, what are you doing here? His voice was strained, unnaturally casual. I think you know why I'm here, I said, my own voice steadier than I expected. I walked further into the office, closing the distance between us. I wasn't going to let him hide behind his desk, behind his computer screen. We need to talk. Not later. Now he sighed, a long, weary sound, and leaned back in his chair, finally dropping the pretense. He looked defeated. There's nothing to talk about, Leo. It was a mistake. I was confused, and I was out of line. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have put you in that position. Each word was a carefully aimed blow, designed to neutralize the situation, to reduce what had happened to a simple, regrettable error in judgment. He was trying to rewrite history, to erase the vulnerability, the honesty of that moment. He was trying to put us back in our old, safe boxes. But I wouldn't let him. I had lived in that box for too long. A mistake, I repeated, my voice laced with a bitterness that surprised even me. Don't do that. Don't you dare diminish what happened. It wasn't a mistake. It was the most honest moment we have had in 10 years of friendship. And you can't just run away from it because it scares you. It doesn't scare me, he retorted, his defensiveness flaring. But his eyes betrayed him. Bullshit, I shot back, my voice rising. You're terrified. I can see it on your face. You've spent your entire life capturing other people's perfect moments, their happiness, their love. You hide behind that camera, a professional observer of emotion, because you're too damn scared to feel any of your own. You came to me, night after night, seeking something you couldn't name. You fell asleep on my shoulder. You stayed in my apartment. You left the door open, Sam. You left the damn door open every single night. And then you kissed me. You asked me if you could kiss me. That wasn't a mistake. That was a choice. And you owe me, you owe us, the respect of being honest about why you made it. My words hung in the air between us, raw and accusatory. I had laid it all bare, all the subtext, all the unspoken rituals. I had dragged our fragile, liminal world into the harsh, unforgiving light. For a moment, he just stared at me, his face pale, his expression a mixture of shock and something else, something that looked like shame. He looked down at his hands, which were clenched into tight fists on his desk. When he finally looked up, the anger was gone, replaced by a profound, heartbreaking sadness. His carefully constructed walls were crumbling, and the lonely, frightened man behind them was finally visible. I don't know, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what I'm doing, Leo. Everything is a mess. After Chloe, I just felt so adrift. And you were just there. You've always been there. Solid, quiet, safe. Being at your place was the only time my head would shut up. The only time I felt calm. He took a shaky breath. When I was with you, it was easy. It felt right. And that night, I don't know. I looked at you, and all I could think was that I didn't want to go to the studio mattress. I didn't want to be in a different room. I just wanted to stay there, with you. The thought of kissing you, it just appeared in my head, and it was the first thing that had felt true, really true. In months, he finally looked me in the eye, and his were swimming with unshed tears. And it scared the hell out of me, he admitted, his voice cracking. Because it felt better than anything I've ever felt. It felt like coming home. And I don't know what that means. I'm a wedding photographer, for God's sake. My whole life is. This, he gestured vaguely around the studio, at the pictures of happy brides and grooms. This is what I understand. This is the script I know. You're not in the script. And I freaked out. I ran. Because it's easier to call it a mistake than to admit that my entire life, everything I thought I wanted, might be wrong. His confession, raw and painful and utterly honest, washed away all of my anger, leaving only a deep, aching empathy. He wasn't rejecting me. He was rejecting the terrifying implications of his own feelings. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself. I closed the remaining distance between us and knelt in front of his chair, taking his clenched fists in my hands. His fingers were cold. I gently uncurled them, lacing my own through them. "Hey," I said softly, forcing him to look at me. "There is no script, Sam. Not for you, not for me. There's just this. Us. We don't have to know what it means right now. We don't have to label it or define it. We just have to not run away from it. Can you do that? Can you just stay? And we can figure out the rest of it together." A single tear escaped and traced a path down his cheek. He nodded, a slow, almost imperceptible movement. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." It wasn't a grand declaration of love. It wasn't a solution to all our problems. But it was a start. It was an agreement to stop running. It was a promise to stay in the darkroom together, to wait patiently, and to see what developed. And for the first time in a week, I felt the tight knot of anxiety in my stomach begin to loosen. The storm had passed, leaving behind a fragile, quiet dawn. The aftermath of our confrontation was not a sudden, cinematic shift into romantic bliss. It was quieter, more tentative than that. It was a process of careful negotiation, of learning a new language together. The grand, unspoken gestures were replaced by small, deliberate acts of verbal honesty. We started to talk, really talk, in a way we never had before. We talked about his fears, his confusion about his own identity, the pressure he felt to live up to a certain image of happiness that his own career seemed to mock. And I talked too, for the first time laying bare the years of my own silent affection, the pain of watching him with other people, the hope I had so carefully guarded. It was like excavating an ancient city, carefully brushing away layers of dust and debris to reveal the foundations that had been there all along. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. We were redrawing the map of our relationship, and we were doing it together. The rituals that had defined our ambiguous phase began to change, imbued with a new sense of intention. The movie nights on the sofa continued, but now, when his head came to rest on my shoulder, it was not a gesture of exhaustion, but one of conscious affection. My hand would find his, our fingers lacing together naturally, without the agonizing internal debate that had once accompanied such a simple act. The anxiety was replaced by a profound sense of peace. The couch was no longer a landscape of agonizing uncertainty. It was simply our place, a harbor. The door to my studio was no longer left ajar. One night, without any discussion, he simply brought his pillow and blanket from the studio and set them on my bed. When it was time to sleep, he followed me into my room, and we lay down together, the thin wall between us finally dissolved. That first night, we didn't do anything but lie there, facing each other in the dark, our hands clasped between us. It was more intimate than any kiss. It was an acknowledgement of a shared space, a shared future. It was the quiet, profound relief of no longer being alone in the dark. We learned each other's rhythms in a new way, the rhythms of sleep, of waking. I learned that he was a restless sleeper, his legs twitching as he chased dream rabbits. He learned that I needed a few minutes of absolute silence in the morning before I could face the world. We fell into a gentle domesticity that felt both thrillingly new and deeply familiar. Making coffee together in the morning, bumping hips in my small kitchen, arguing over what to have for dinner. These were the small, mundane bricks with which we began to build our new foundation. It was a foundation of quiet certainty, of gentle reassurance. There were still moments of fear, of awkwardness, flashes of his old panic. But now, instead of running, he would voice it. "This is still weird for me sometimes," he would admit, and I would just hold him and say, "I know. Me too. But we're okay." And we were. It was a few months into this new, fragile, beautiful life that I finally asked him about the photograph. It had been hanging on the wall of his office, the one I had seen the day of our confrontation. A simple, black-framed print. It was the only personal photograph in the entire studio, the only image not taken for a client. It was the picture he had taken of me that summer afternoon, years ago, in his old apartment. The one where I was sitting on the floor, laughing, bathed in golden light. I had seen it that day, but in the emotional turmoil, I hadn't truly registered its significance. Now, standing in his studio on a quiet Sunday, helping him pack up gear from a weekend wedding, I found myself drawn to it again. Why this one? I asked, my voice soft. Of all the pictures you've ever taken, of all the people, why is this the only one you've ever framed for yourself? He came to stand beside me, his arm brushing against mine. He stared at the photograph for a long time, a soft, nostalgic smile playing on his lips. I took this about a year before I met Chloe, he said quietly. It was that day you came over to help me test out that new portrait lens. Do you remember? We spent the whole afternoon just messing around. I nodded. I remembered the day perfectly. I remembered the warmth of the sun on my skin, the easy laughter, the familiar, comfortable ache of being near him. I took hundreds of photos that day, he continued, his eyes still fixed on the image. Technical shots, mostly, testing the focus, the depth of field. But then, for a second, you just looked up. You were telling me that stupid story about your painting professor, and you were laughing, and the light from the window hit you just right. He paused, turning to look at me, his expression full of a tenderness that still made my heart ache. And in that moment, the camera just disappeared. I wasn't a photographer taking a test shot. I was just me, looking at you. And I saw everything. I saw your kindness, your patience, the way you saw the world. I saw my best friend. And for a split second, a thought went through my head, clear as a bell. Oh, that's what it's supposed to feel like, happiness. Not the big, loud, performative kind I shoot every weekend. Just that. Quiet. Real. Easy. He reached out and traced my jawline in the photograph with his finger. It scared me, he admitted, echoing his confession from months before. So I buried it. I printed the picture, and I told myself it was just a technically perfect shot, a great example of natural light. I hung it on my wall as a professional reminder. But it was a lie. I hung it up because I needed to see you every day. I think, subconsciously, I was trying to remind myself of what home felt like, even when I was trying to build it with someone else, somewhere else. This picture, it was my compass. It was always pointing back to you. I just wasn't brave enough to follow it until now. His words settled over me, a balm on old wounds I didn't even know I still carried. All those years of uncertainty, a feeling like I was the only one living in our secret, one-sided love story. But he had been there too, in his own way. He had seen it, felt it, and captured it in a single, perfect frame. He had kept the proof, even when he couldn't admit the truth to himself. I leaned my head on his shoulder, the same way he had done on my sofa so many times, but this time it was different. It was a gesture of mutual comfort, of shared understanding. We stood there for a long time, in the quiet of his studio, surrounded by the ghosts of other people's happy beginnings, and felt the profound, peaceful certainty of our own. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. The quiet that had once been filled with my unspoken yearning and his unexamined loneliness was now a space of deep contentment. It was the quiet of two people who no longer needed words to understand each other, who had found in the other a place to finally, truly be still. The shutter had clicked long ago, capturing a moment of unconscious truth. But it took us years to step into the darkroom, to have the courage to face the messy, beautiful, and complicated process of bringing that image to light. And as we stood there, bathed in the soft afternoon sun filtering through the studio window, I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that we were just at the beginning. We were finally developing the picture of a life together, one quiet, honest moment at a time.